These stories, which I have prepared for you, amaze even the most skeptical researchers of anomalous phenomena. 3 encounters with unknown creatures in the Appalachians are forcing us to rethink our ideas about what lurks in the dense forests of the East Coast. Today, you'll hear accounts from eyewitnesses who have encountered phenomena that science cannot yet explain. Get ready for stories about creatures that can mimic human footsteps, walk on 2 legs, and display intelligence bordering on that of humans. But before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm curious to see how far these stories are reaching. The first incident occurred in October 2019 in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, on the border between North Carolina and Tennessee. I found some information stating that 2 tourists, Mike Rodriguez and his friend Jason Clark, set out on a 3-day hike along the Appalachian Trail. Mike worked as an electrician in Raleigh, and Jason taught physical education at a local school. They were experienced hikers who went into the mountains every year, so what happened to them cannot be attributed to the panic of novices. On October 1st, around 8 a.m., they left the parking lot at the park entrance. They planned to walk to the Charles Bannon parking lot, set up camp, and hike up to the observation deck the next day. They knew the route well, having traveled it 3 times before. The first few hours went smoothly. Mike recalls that around noon they stopped for a snack by a small stream, and that was when they first heard noises behind them. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the echo of their own footsteps, but when they stopped to drink some water, the sounds continued for a few more seconds. Jason was the first to notice it. He turned around and looked down the trail but didn't see anyone. Mike suggested that they might be other hikers who had fallen behind the group, since there were a lot of people in the park. They continued on their way, but now both were listening for sounds behind them. The footsteps repeated every time they took a step, but when they stopped to adjust their backpacks or tie their shoelaces, the sound stopped as well, though with a slight delay. By noon, this was starting to really worry them. Mike looked back several times, but the trail behind them was empty, and yet the footsteps didn't stop. What's more, it seemed as though the distance between them and the source of the sound remained constant, as if someone were deliberately maintaining the same distance. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they decided to conduct an experiment. They stopped, and the footsteps ceased. But as soon as Mike took a few steps forward, he immediately heard the same sounds behind him. Jason tried clapping his hands. There was no reaction. But as soon as they started walking again, the footsteps resumed. Jason suggested they veer off the trail and wait until whoever was following them had passed by. They went down the slope about 20 meters and hid behind some large rocks. They waited for about half an hour, but no one showed up. When they returned to the trail and continued on their way, they heard footsteps again. By evening, they had reached their campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a designated spot for a campfire and a table. There were no other hikers, which suited them just fine. They pitched their tent, built a campfire, and cooked dinner. All that time, complete silence reigned in the forest around them. The documents state that Mike recalled that during dinner they had discussed the day's events several times, and that Jason was convinced someone was following them, but couldn't figure out who or why. Mike, on the other hand, was inclined to believe in the theory of an acoustic illusion, that sounds can bounce off the mountains in very strange ways, but even he wasn't convinced by his own explanation. Around 10 o'clock that evening, they went to bed. The campfire had almost burned out. Only embers remained. Mike fell asleep pretty quickly, while Jason tossed and turned for a while longer, but eventually fell asleep too. But soon, they both woke up at the same time to the sound of branches snapping. Mike immediately glanced at his watch. It was 2:30 in the morning. The sounds were coming from the forest, about 30 meters from their camp. It wasn't the crunch of dry branches underfoot, but rather a rustling, as if someone were pushing through dense underbrush or making their way through debris. Jason quietly called out to Mike and pointed at the flashlight. Mike nodded and turned on his headlamp. The beam of light illuminated the trees in front of their tent, but nothing out of the ordinary was visible. The sounds continued, moving in a circle around the clearing. It seemed as if something very large was circling their camp, not coming too close but not moving away either. This went on for about 10 minutes, after which the sounds stopped just as suddenly as they had started. Mike and Jason lay there for another half hour, listening intently for the slightest sound, but silence once again fell over the forest. Eventually, they fell asleep, though their sleep was restless. That morning, they searched the clearing, trying to find any traces. The forest floor was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves, so they couldn't find any clear footprints. But in several places, they found broken branches about 2 meters above the ground. The branches were as thick as an adult's arm, and it would have taken considerable effort to break them. Jason tried to reach one of the broken branches, but even standing on his tiptoes, he couldn't quite reach it. Mike was taller, but even he had to stand on his tiptoes to touch the brake. It seemed as if someone very tall was simply walking through the forest, paying no attention to the obstacles. They broke camp faster than usual and continued on their way. The plan was to go up to the observation deck, take a few photos, and head back down to the car by evening. But about an hour after they set out, they heard footsteps behind them again. Now the sounds were louder and clearer, as if whoever was making them had become less cautious. Mike suggested they stop abruptly and turn around quickly to try to get a look at their pursuer. They turned around as if on cue, but the trail behind them was empty. This time, however, they heard something large moving quickly away from the trail, snapping branches and rustling the leaves. The sounds in the forest fell silent, but after a few minutes, the footsteps resumed. By noon, the situation had become critical. The footsteps were now coming not only from behind, but also from the right and left of the trail, as if they were surrounded. Mike recalls that he began to panic. The nearest forest ranger station was 5 kilometers down the trail. They turned around and headed back at a brisk pace, almost running. The footsteps behind them grew louder, and now there were several, at least 2 or maybe even 3 sources of sound. Jason looked back and shouted that he could see movement in the bushes about 50 meters behind them. Mike turned around too and saw the branches of the tall bushes swaying. The swaying was too strong for the wind and ran parallel to the trail. I followed it. The height of the swaying branches indicated that the source was about 2.5 meters above the ground. They ran out into the open, paying no attention to their heavy backpacks or their fatigue. They too were no longer hiding. The crunch of branches and the rustle of leaves indicated that something very large was moving through the forest parallel to the trail, without making much of an effort to stay hidden. After about a kilometer, they came to an open stretch of the trail where the forest parted, forming something like a meadow. They stopped there to catch their breath and looked back. The sounds had stopped. 2 hours later, they arrived at the forest ranger station, where a young ranger named Steve Connor was on duty. Mike and Jason told him what had happened. Steve listened carefully to what they had to say and remarked that reports like these come in frequently, especially in the fall. According to him, black bears live in the park and are particularly active in the fall as they prepare for hibernation. The bear could very well have followed them, drawn by the smell of food from their backpacks. And the snapping of branches and rustling in the bushes were typical behaviors of a bear exploring its territory. The explanation sounded logical, but one thing bothered Mike. He had encountered bears in the forest many times and knew how they moved and what sounds they made. What they heard sounded more like the footsteps of a 2-legged creature, a steady rhythm that mirrored their own movements. A bear can't walk like that. Jason also expressed his doubts. In his opinion, a bear would not have pursued people for so long and so methodically, maintaining a constant distance. Bears usually either avoid encounters with people or approach them openly if they're interested in food. Steve shrugged and said that the mountains are full of mysteries and not everything can be explained at first glance. He offered to let them spend the night at the station, but Mike and Jason decided to drive home. By evening, they were already in Raleigh. A few weeks later, Mike contacted the park administration to find out if they had received any similar reports. He was told that in October there had been 4 reports from tourists complaining about strange noises and the feeling that someone was watching them. All the incidents took place in the same area of the park where he and Jason had been. That reassured him. It meant they weren't the only ones who had encountered something unusual. On the other hand, new questions have arisen. If it really was a bear, why was it so active in that particular area? And why was its behavior so different from usual? The answers to these questions emerged a month later when a second incident occurred. This time it took place in the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. Thomas Miller and his son David went deer hunting in November of that year. Thomas worked as a mechanic in Richmond, and David was in college. Hunting was their annual tradition, and they had been coming to this area for 10 years in a row. They knew the area like the back of their hand. On November 5th, they set up camp near an old forest road in an area where there were usually plenty of deer trails. The weather was cold but dry, ideal conditions for hunting. The plan was simple: get up before dawn, take up positions at opposite ends of a small valley, and wait for the deer to come out to feed. On the morning of November the 6th, they scattered to their respective positions. Thomas took up a position on a small hill from which he had a clear view of the valley. David set up camp about 300 meters away from him, by a stream where deer usually came to drink. Around 7 in the morning, Thomas noticed some movement on the opposite slope of the valley. He thought it was a deer, but when he looked through his binoculars, he saw something strange. The animal was moving on all fours, but its silhouette did not resemble that of a deer. Its fur was gray, and its body seemed too long for a wolf and too thin for a bear. He watched the animal for about 10 minutes. It moved cautiously, often stopping to sniff the air, then suddenly stood up on its hind legs. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. The creature was standing upright, just like a human, and was at least 2 meters tall. It remained in that position for about 30 seconds, turning its head from side to side as if surveying the surroundings. Then it got down on all fours and headed straight for where David was standing. Thomas tried to contact his son on the walkie-talkie, but all he could hear was static. He gathered his things and quickly made his way to the stream, where he was supposed to be waiting. When Thomas got there, his son wasn't there. But on the soft ground by the stream, he noticed some tracks that shocked him. Next to David's tracks were other tracks. And the strangest thing was that in several places there were imprints that looked very much like human footprints, only much larger and with claws. Thomas called out to his son, and a few minutes later, David answered from somewhere in the thicket. He emerged from the bushes, pale and agitated, and said that about 20 minutes earlier, a huge wolf had approached the stream. At first, it was drinking water, and then it suddenly stood up on its hind legs and walked straight toward him. He said that the creature moved like a human, but its arms were too long. They reached almost to its knees. Its muzzle was elongated, like a wolf's, but its eyes were positioned at the front of its head rather than on the sides, like a predator's. When it got within 20 meters, David fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare it away. The creature stopped but didn't run away. It looked at David for a few seconds, then let out a sound, turned around and walked off into the woods, not on all fours but on 2 legs, like a human. Thomas carefully examined the tracks by the stream. The paw prints were fresh. The soil around them was still crumbly. They were about 1 foot long and 6 inches wide, with the toes splayed and claw marks about 1 inch long. What struck him most were the footprints of a bipedal creature. They looked very much like human footprints. The toes were long and had sharp claws. The depth of the tracks indicated that the creature weighed at least 150 kilograms. They took photos of the tracks with their phones and decided to leave immediately. While packing up for camp, they heard strange noises coming from the woods, and when they got back to the car, they noticed something else odd. There were scratches on the hood, deep ones that had gone through the paint down to the metal. Thomas pressed his palm against the scratches. They were almost twice as wide as his hand. On their way home, they stopped by to see the local sheriff, James Walker, who had been working in the area for 20 years, and showed him photos of the tracks and told him about their encounter. The sheriff listened carefully to what they had to say and remarked that this was already the 3rd such incident in the past month. The first one involved a group of students who were having a party in the woods. They claimed to have seen a huge wolf walking on its hind legs. A gamekeeper who was checking the traps was involved in the second incident. He found several torn traps and tracks from an unknown animal nearby. The sheriff speculated that a large bear that had not gone into hibernation had appeared in the forest. These bears can be very aggressive and unpredictable. The ability to stand on its hind legs is normal behavior for a bear trying to get a better look at a source of danger or something that has caught its interest. Thomas objected, saying that he had seen the creature walking on 2 legs, not just standing there. A bear can stand on its hind legs for a few seconds, but it cannot walk in that position. Moreover, the tracks were clearly not those of a bear. The sheriff agreed that the tracks were indeed strange, but he had no other explanation. He promised to pass this information on to the Wildlife Protection Agency and asked Thomas and David to let him know if they saw anything else unusual. 2 weeks later, Thomas read a report in the local newspaper stating that the remains of several deer had been found in the forest. The carcasses had been torn apart with such force that it was difficult for experts to determine which predator could have done it. The tracks around the remains did not match those of any animal known to inhabit the region. A week later, a 3rd incident occurred, which finally convinced everyone that something unusual had appeared in the Appalachian forests. The incident in Pennsylvania marked a turning point, as that was the first time a case of direct aggression by an unknown creature had been recorded. In mid-November, brothers Kevin and Mark O'Connor were hiking the Appalachian Trail near Blue Mountain. Kevin worked as a lumberjack, and Mark worked as a truck driver. Both were strong men, accustomed to physical labor, and not prone to panic. They planned to cover the 30-kilometer stretch of trail in 2 days. The first day passed without incident. They spent the night at a designated campsite, a small clearing by a stream. They built a campfire, had dinner, and went to bed around 10 p.m. They were awakened by a loud crash. Someone or something had thrown a rock the size of a soccer ball into their campfire. The embers flew in all directions and several red-hot coals fell onto their sleeping bags. The brothers jumped up and began to put out the smoldering fabric. Mark was the first to think to shine the flashlight in the direction from which the rock had come. He illuminated the edge of the clearing, but no one was in sight. Instead, they heard a sound that made the air vibrate. It lasted about 10 seconds, then stopped. Kevin took a hunting knife out of his backpack and stood next to his brother. They stood back to back, shining their flashlights on the forest surrounding the clearing. Silence reigned for a few minutes, and then they heard the crackling of branches somewhere to their left. Mark shone his flashlight in that direction and saw a silhouette among the trees. The creature stood on its hind legs and was about 3 meters tall. Its body was covered in dark fur. Its arms were long and its head was large and elongated. But the most terrifying thing about it was its eyes, which reflected the light of the flashlight like an animal's, but the expression in them was almost human. The creature stared at them motionlessly for about 30 seconds. Then it slowly turned and disappeared into the forest. The brothers didn't wait until morning. They quickly gathered their belongings and, using flashlights to light their way, set off down the trail in the dark. Sounds came from behind, the crackling of branches, the rustling of leaves, and sometimes that same low growl. It seemed as though the creature was following them, but keeping its distance. After walking for about an hour, they came out onto the road where they had left their car. Just as they were getting into the car, a loud, dull thud rang out nearby, as if someone had punched a tree. Then the roar sounded again, but this time there was a hint of disappointment or anger in it. They left without looking back. The next morning, Kevin contacted the local wildlife protection agency and told them what had happened. He was put in touch with a biologist named Daniel Hartley, who was studying large predators in that region. Hartley listened to Kevin's account and asked a number of detailed questions about the creature's appearance, behavior, and the sounds it made. At the end of the conversation, he noted that such reports are becoming increasingly frequent and that the agency is considering organizing an expedition to study this phenomenon. According to Hartley, the descriptions provided by eyewitnesses do not match any known species of animal in North America. The greatest resemblance is to great apes, but there are none in the wild on this continent. There is a theory that these creatures escaped from zoos. Hartley also noted that the aggressive behavior described by the O'Connor brothers is atypical for most wild animals. Animals generally avoid contact with humans, and direct confrontation occurs only when they are defending their young or their territory. However, throwing stones into the fire seems more like a show of force or a warning. The most interesting part began after Hartley organized a small research team. In December 2019, 4 experts, 2 biologists, a criminologist, and an experienced tracker traveled to the Blue Mountains region to find physical evidence of the existence of an unknown animal. Over the course of 3 days, they discovered numerous tracks, several tufts of fur on the branches of the bushes, and something resembling a nest or a den in the dense underbrush. The tracks did not match any of the cataloged species. The size, shape, and depth of the prints indicated a bipedal creature weighing between 120 and 150 kilograms. The wool samples were sent to a laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania for genetic analysis. The results were strange. DNA analysis revealed a mixture of genetic material characteristic of bears and primates, but with segments that did not match any known mammal species. The lab repeated the test twice, but the result remained the same. Dr. Susan Reed, the geneticist who conducted the study, stated that either the samples had been contaminated in the field, or this was an animal unknown to science, possibly a hybrid. But the most important discovery awaited Hartley's team on the last day of the expedition. Tracker Robert Chase found distinct tracks in the snow left by 2 different creatures. Judging by the tracks, the animals were moving together, periodically switching from walking on all 4s to walking on 2 legs. The stride length while standing on 2 legs was nearly 1.5 meters, indicating immense height. But most importantly, the footprints showed that the creatures used primitive tools. Pointed sticks and stones with signs of having been worked were found near the paw prints. They were clearly used to break something hard, as they bore characteristic chips and scratches. Hartley photographed and sketched all the finds, and also made plaster casts of the best imprints. The team returned with findings that could have revolutionized scientific understanding of North American fauna, but then administrative problems arose. The Wildlife Protection Service demanded that the expedition's findings be kept confidential until further research is conducted. Officially, this was explained as a need to avoid panic among tourists and prevent an influx of thrill-seeking hunters into the national parks. In fact, as Hartley later discovered, federal agencies had intervened in the matter. Representatives of an unnamed agency confiscated all of the expedition's materials, including samples, photographs, and recordings. The team members were asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Hartley refused to sign the document and was dismissed from the Wildlife Service a month later due to staff cuts. The criminologist was transferred to another state. Pioneer Chase signed the agreement, but 6 months later he told Hartley that people in plain clothes had approached him several times and asked him not to speak to reporters. The second biologist on the team, Dr. Michael Green, attempted to publish an article about the findings in a scientific journal. The article was rejected by 3 different journals without explanation. When Green asked his colleagues for advice, they suggested that he focus on other research. By the spring of 2020, all members of the expedition had either remained silent or been reassigned to other duties. Officially, no unknown animals had been discovered in the Appalachians. Reports from eyewitnesses continued to come in, but now they were attributed to bears, dogs that had escaped from home, or hallucinations. Dr. Susan Reed from the genetics lab contacted Hartley privately and told her that federal agents had come to see her as well. They took all the samples and test results and ordered her to destroy the copies of the data. She did not fully comply and saved the records on her personal computer, but was afraid to publish them. According to her, genetic analysis showed that the hair found belonged to an unknown species of primate that was evolutionarily close to humans, but more primitive. This genetic lineage dates back approximately 100,000 years, which means that these creatures evolved alongside Homo sapiens, but in isolation. Reed speculated that the population of these creatures may have survived in remote areas of the Appalachians thanks to their caution and small numbers. However, climate change, deforestation, and the growing number of tourists have forced them to leave their usual habitats and come into contact with humans. The analysis also revealed signs of inbreeding, which is typical of small, isolated populations. This meant that very few individuals remained, perhaps just a few families or flocks. They were on the verge of extinction, which explained their aggressive behavior. The most recent reliable information about these creatures was received in March 2020. Ranger Martha Wilson was patrolling the Great Smoky Mountains area, where Mike and Jason had encountered strange noises a year earlier. She discovered a ransacked campsite and signs of a fierce struggle. The tents had been torn apart, backpacks were scattered about, and food supplies had been destroyed. The trees surrounding the clearing bore deep scratches at a height of 3 meters above the ground. In the soft soil near the stream, Wilson discovered the same strange tracks, huge paw prints and footprints of bipedal creatures. But there were no tourists to be found. Their car was parked in the parking lot, and their documents and valuables were left in their tents. The search continued for a week, but the people were never found. They were officially declared missing, presumably after getting lost in the woods. Following this incident, access to several areas of the Appalachians was restricted under the pretext of protecting rare plant species. Tourist routes were altered, and some trails were closed to visitors. Patrols were stepped up, but forest rangers were ordered not to discuss the reasons for the new restrictions with visitors. Reports of encounters with unknown creatures continued to come in, but they were now carefully screened out. Eyewitnesses were convinced that what they had seen were bears or other common animals. Those who insisted on their version of events were threatened with legal action for spreading false information that could harm the tourism industry. By the summer of 2020, the topic of unidentified creatures in the Appalachians had virtually disappeared from official reports. The COVID-19 pandemic shifted the public's attention to other issues. The national parks were closed for several months, giving the wildlife a break from human presence. When the parks reopened, the number of reports of strange encounters dropped sharply. Perhaps the creatures have learned to avoid humans more effectively. Perhaps their population has dwindled to a critical level. Or perhaps the system for concealing information has become more effective. As far as I know, mainstream science still denies the existence of unknown primates in the forests of North America. But on the internet, you can find hundreds of accounts from people who claim to have seen something unusual in the Appalachians. Most of these stories are dismissed as fabrications or attempts to attract attention. However, Mike Rodriguez, Thomas and David Miller, the O'Connor brothers, and many other eyewitnesses continue to insist that their accounts are true. They claim that the remote forests of the East Coast are home to creatures that science is not yet ready to acknowledge. These creatures are intelligent and cautious, but capable of aggression if cornered. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. It is possible that the Appalachians are indeed home to a relict population of unknown primates, the last survivors of an ancient evolutionary lineage that managed to survive in isolation for millennia. And perhaps their time is coming to an end, since the modern world leaves no room for secrets. Or maybe this is just the beginning. Climate change is forcing many animals to move to new habitats. Deep forests are becoming less habitable due to droughts and wildfires. Creatures that have hidden from humans for centuries are forced to venture into open areas in search of food and water. If that is the case, then encounters with the unknown inhabitants of the forest will become more frequent. And sooner or later, enough evidence will accumulate to force the scientific community to acknowledge their existence. The only question is whether anything will remain by then that can be recognized, or whether these last witnesses to an ancient era will disappear, just as the mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and other giants of the past have disappeared.